Her fingers had transformed into claws, coated in dark, scaly skin, each tip ending in a razor-sharp talon. Sarah had always been the kind of girl who lit up any room she walked into. With her golden hair, bright blue eyes, and a smile that seemed to hold the sun, she was often called an angel by those who knew her. She had a way of making everyone feel safe, loved, and seen. It was as if her very presence could ward off the shadows that lurked in the corners of every soul. But Sarah was not an angel. That truth began to unravel one fateful night when her best friend, Emily, stayed over at her house. They were both 16, filled with dreams of the future and the endless possibilities that awaited them. The night had started like any other sleepover: movies, popcorn, and gossip. They had shared stories, laughed about school crushes, and talked about their hopes and fears as the hours slipped by. As the clock struck midnight, the atmosphere shifted. The room, once filled with warmth and laughter, grew cold. The shadows in the corners deepening, stretching towards the center of the room as if alive. Emily felt an unease settle in the pit of her stomach, but she brushed it off as nothing more than a trick of the light. Emily, feeling restless and unnerved by the sudden chill, decided to get a glass of water. She carefully climbed out of her sleeping bag, trying not to wake Sarah, who seemed to have drifted off. As she tiptoed down the hallway, she noticed something odd. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, and the usually cozy home now seemed foreign, its comforting familiarity replaced by an unsettling silence. As she reached the kitchen, Emily's gaze was drawn to the basement door at the far end of the hallway. It stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling out. Sarah had always forbidden anyone from going down there, insisting it was just a dusty old storage space with nothing of interest. But now soft, almost inaudible whispers floated up from the depths, beckoning her. Curiosity warred with fear as Emily crept towards the door. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and she could almost make out words, though they were in a language she didn't understand. Something about the voices was hypnotic, luring her closer despite the terror gnawing at her insides. Unable to resist, Emily slowly turned the doorknob, her heart pounding in her chest. The door creaked open to reveal a staircase descending into blackness. The basement was dark, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow light, thick and impenetrable. But something was moving down there, a faint rustling, like the sound of wings brushing against stone. Emily squinted, trying to make out the shapes. The shadows seemed to shift and writhe as if alive, forming grotesque figures that danced along the walls. And then she saw her. Sarah was standing in the middle of the room, but she was different. Her golden hair had turned jet black, hanging in tangled, wet strands around her face. Her eyes, once bright and blue, were now pools of darkness, empty and cold. Her once comforting smile was twisted into something sinister, a cruel mockery of the warmth Emily had known. Surrounding Sarah were shadows, not of people, but of twisted, tormented figures. They writhed and clawed at the air as if trapped in an invisible prison, their faces contorted in eternal agony. Emily could hear their whispers now, clearer than before, pleading, begging for release, for mercy that would never come. Sarah, Emily's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with fear. Sarah's head snapped up, her dark eyes locking onto Emily's. For a moment, there was silence, a tense stillness that hung in the air like a held breath. Then, Sarah spoke, but her voice was no longer the sweet, melodic tone Emily knew. It was layered with something else, something ancient and malevolent, a voice that echoed as if it came from the very walls around them. "You shouldn't have come here, Emily," Sarah said, her voice sending shivers down Emily's spine. Emily took a step back, but it was too late. The shadows began to swirl around Sarah, merging with her, becoming one with her. The air grew colder, a biting chill that cut to the bone, and the room filled with a terrible, howling wind. It tore at Emily's clothes and hair, and she could feel it pulling at her, tugging at her very soul. "I'm not what you think I am," Sarah continued, her form now shifting, growing taller, more menacing, her features twisted and elongated, her fingers stretching into clawed talons, her mouth widening into a grotesque grin that split her face. I never was. I've worn this human shell for so long, I almost forgot what I truly am. Emily tried to scream, but the air was thick, her voice lost in the cacophony of the wind and the whispers. She could feel the darkness creeping up her legs, pulling her down into the abyss that had opened beneath her feet. The shadows reached out with grasping hands, their touch cold and suffocating. Please, Sarah, stop, Emily cried, tears streaming down her face, her body trembling with fear. But the thing that was once Sarah only laughed, a sound that reverberated through the very core of Emily's being. It was a laugh devoid of joy, filled instead with malice and hunger. You were always so trusting, so easy to deceive, that's why I chose you, Emily. I needed someone close, someone who wouldn't suspect, someone whose soul would be the perfect vessel. Emily's vision began to blur as the darkness consumed her. She could feel her life slipping away, her mind fracturing under the weight of the horrors she was witnessing. The shadows whispered to her, their voices like ice against her skin, promising pain, suffering, and eternal torment. But just before the darkness consumed her completely, Emily glimpsed the creature's true form, the one that had masqueraded as her friend for so long. It was a demon, ancient and malevolent, its essence a living nightmare. Its eyes blazed like infernos from the depths of hell, twin embers of molten rage, and its wings were vast, forged from the blackest night, spreading wide to cloak the room in a suffocating veil of despair. The demon loomed over her, its presence overwhelming, its power undeniable. Its body was a chaotic mass of shifting shadows and roiling smoke, never settling, always in flux. Horns spiraled from its skull, cruel and jagged, and its mouth gaped wide, filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth that gleamed menacingly in the darkness. "You'll make a wonderful addition to my collection," the demon murmured, its voice a deadly caress that sent icy shivers down Emily's spine, and then everything went black. When Emily awoke, she was no longer in the basement. She found herself standing in the middle of the town square, but the world around her was grotesquely altered. The sky was a sickly, unnatural green, swirling with black clouds that crackled with ominous energy. The buildings that had once been familiar and comforting were now twisted and decayed, their windows shattered, their walls crumbling into ruin. The figures moving around her were not people, but hideously deformed creatures. Their skin was pallid and stretched tightly over their skeletal frames, their eyes hollow and devoid of life. Their faces were locked in expressions of eternal agony, their mouths frozen in silent screams. They shuffled aimlessly through the square, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by some unseen hand. Emily looked down at her hands and let out a scream of pure terror. They were no longer her own. Her fingers had transformed into claws, coated in dark, scaly skin, each tip ending in a razor-sharp talon. Her entire body had been grotesquely altered, her spine contorted painfully, her limbs distorted and stretched into unnatural, grotesque shapes. Desperation gripped her as she caught her reflection in a shattered window. The image staring back at her confirmed her worst fear. She had become one of them, a twisted, tormented creature, forever trapped in the demon's hellish world. And Sarah was gone, or rather, the demon had taken her place in the real world, wearing her face, living her life. It would continue its deception, luring in the unsuspecting and feeding on their souls, just as it had done to Emily, because Sarah had never been an angel. She had always been a demon, and now, Emily was just another one of her countless victims, lost to the darkness forever. But as Emily wandered through the twisted nightmare she now called home, a deeper horror began to dawn on her. She was not alone in her torment. The other creatures, the twisted souls trapped in this hellish realm, had once been people to Sarah's other friends, family members, neighbors, each one ensnared by the demon's web of deceit, just as Emily had been. And now, they were all trapped together, their souls bound to this nightmare world, forever at the mercy of the demon that had once called itself Sarah. As the full realization sank in, Emily felt a cold, creeping dread settle over her. She was no longer just a victim. She was part of something much darker, much more sinister. She was a pawn in the demon's eternal game of torment and despair, and the worst part, there was no escape, no hope, no salvation, only the darkness.